I want to begin by telling you the story of how the land trust began. In approximately 1987, there was a proposal for a golf driving range at a property, a 22-acre property at the corner of Day Road and 305, right there. The proposal included 60-foot high towers with high-intensity lights and webbing or meshing that would be 45 feet high wrapped around the entire facility. Needless to say, neighbors in the community were alarmed. This is a spectacularly beautiful and important property. You've probably all driven by it. You may have actually been out there. Rolling rural land, high hills and forest in the background. Back then, and still today, when people come to the island from Agate Pass Bridge, it's really the first major interior view of Bainbridge Island, a piece of property that really tells people what Bainbridge Island is and what we value there. As you might expect on Bainbridge Island, a number of organizations and individuals rallied to oppose this proposal. Ultimately, it was defeated. But a number of people, including Nate Thomas and Jim Cutler and myself, started talking afterwards. And we realized that although we had won the battle and defeated this proposal, the war was not over. The owners of the property, a multi-generation family, well-intended and not affiliated with that particular proposal, still needed to sell that property. And it was at serious risk of being divided up into 11 2-acre parcels. And we did not want to see that happen. So Nate actually went out and did a little searching around and came up with this idea of a land trust and did some research to get some more information and started inviting people over to his house for meetings where we talked about all sorts of ideas, the growing population, the threat of excessive development, the fact that land use laws did not seem to be protecting the most important lands the way we wanted to see them protected here on the island. And by the third meeting, there was quite a bit of interest and focus and enthusiasm about creating a land trust. And then someone in the group, a more cynical member of the group, asked this question: do we really think that anybody on Bainbridge Island is going to give a conservation easement and give a substantial value of their property away? And there was a pause. The room was silent. It seemed to be for a very long time. It might have only been for seconds. It was important that we be able to answer that question, but we didn't know. In the back of the room, there was a short, 80-something-year-old woman who raised her hand and stood up, barely taller than the rest of the crowd who was sitting, and she said, "I will." Truly a defining moment for the Bainbridge Island Land Trust. That woman was Phyllis Young, who we have since honored an annual award at the Land Trust for the non-board member of the community who embodies and embraces the values and mission of the Bainbridge Island Land Trust. Her statement gave us the confidence that there was at least one person who was willing to do this, and it would be worth the effort of forming a land trust and going through that process, even if we only conserved that one property, and maybe that property on 305 and Day Road. By 1989, we formed a Washington nonprofit corporation, got all the necessary paperwork created and filed, and obtained the IRS 501c3 nonprofit designation. The original board members were 7 as follows: Nate Thomas, an architect; Jim Cutler, an architect; Mike Ryherd, a lobbyist; Maureen Buckley, a realtor; Erica Zagate, a community activist; Larry Luce, a high school teacher; and myself, Paul Kuntz, a lawyer at the time. We had no money. We had no staff, we had no office, we had no land trust experience, but we were quite determined to get this thing off the ground, and there certainly was a lot of determination and passion and some raw talent within that group of people. But more importantly, it was the right idea for the community at the right time. The community as a whole recognized the threat that was coming of excessive development on the island. There were still a lot of very important properties to be conserved, and the community had the will and determination to actually back this idea up with action and money and votes. The first two projects of the Land Trust were Phyllis Young's property and what later became Willowbrook Farm. Phyllis Young owned the sand spit at the Battle Point property there. We sort of assumed that would be the first property that we would conserve. But Phyllis rightfully engaged all of her adult children in the process of thinking about conserving that sand spit for perpetuity. And back then, and I think still to today, in the Land Trust community, we have something called the 40 cups of tea idea. And the notion is that it takes a lot of meetings and discussions with a property owner to get to the point where they're donating or even selling a conservation easement. It's an important decision. We're talking about somebody giving away a valuable piece of land and conserving it forever. And it justifies that pace of drinking tea and a number of meetings. And that certainly was true with Phyllis, but ultimately we were successful in doing that. But as it turns out, we returned, of course, almost immediately to the property at Day Road, because in fact the owners, about the time we actually put the papers together to form the land trust, the for sale signs went out on the property. It was a time, as we have every 5 or 10 years, a very hot real estate market, and we knew that the property wouldn't last for very long. So we immediately approached the owners, told them who we are. We're quite frank about the fact that we had no money, no staff, no history, no success, but we really wanted to save this. And this wonderful multi-generational family, who also shared an interest in seeing this saved, but needed the money from the sale of the property, were willing to sign a purchase and sale agreement with us with a refundable $2,000 deposit. We had passed the hat among a small group of people to come up with that. But they were even willing to give back the money to us if we failed. They gave us 6 months to figure out how to buy that property, the 22-acre property. What we did is we essentially just turned around and put it back on the market, subject to a conservation easement that would conserve all but 2 acres, tucked away. Our architect members found the most ideal place to put a house and a barn and other structures down low parts of the valley, so it would have the least amount of impact on the views you got through the property. We were fortunate to get 3 separate offers on the property at full price with different ideas as to how the owner would like to interact with that conservation. We ultimately selected Mike Reihert and Dottie Parcheski as the purchasers because they were willing to agree to the most stringent restrictions on the property. And that property, instead of becoming a golf driving range, is now our beloved Willowbrook Farm. And it continues to play that role of introducing visitors from the north to Bainbridge Island. Since then, we've had many great board members come join the organization. I like to say actually those first 2 generations were also founders. There were 7 of us at the table there, but the thing really didn't take off until we brought a lot of other people on board in this cause, including my good friend and colleague Connie Waddington and many others. But with each generation of board members, we expanded the skills and the reach into the community and the resources and the talent to help grow this organization. Not all nonprofits survive those first few years or survive their founders. In fact, there's a concept called founder syndrome. And it's true in the private sector that organizations don't pass their individual founder or small group of founders. But it's a testament, I believe, to the strength of this organization, the importance of this mission, and the values of our community that this idea and this organization grew and prospered and got stronger and smarter and more effective generation after generation. And you 4 are part of the next generation. At the same time, the land trust movement was taking off. here in the state of Washington. When we formed this land trust, there were only two other land trusts in the state of Washington. San Juan Preservation Trust, which was a true land trust and has been very successful. And then there was sort of an unusual hybrid over in Yakima that was created actually by a governmental entity to steward one significant park along the river as it ran through town, and hasn't done all the things that traditional land trusts do. But we were part of a wave of land trusts in this region. I'd say probably within a year or two of our formation, 7 or 8 other land trusts were formed, many of whom celebrate the same year celebration. Here in Kitsap County, we have the Great Peninsula Conservancy, Jefferson Land Trust, and many others. There are now 28 land trusts in the state of Washington. I think the number nationwide now is actually closer to 1,900, but somewhere many more than there were back in those days. You know, in addition, many great projects followed those first two. Almost after those two, the big ones started rolling in. The Grand Forest, Gasm Lake, Meigs Park, Port Blakely. They were, and each one had a different strategy, a different approach. You know, in the early days, since we had so little money, we were doing conservation easements that were being donated to us. The big projects depended heavily on state grants and county grants, but more importantly, Bainbridge Island voter approved park levies, first for the Grand Forest, then for the Gasm Lake properties. And that was really, I think, the start of a movement here on Bainbridge Island. Those early successes, those big wins, really got everybody's attention, enthusiasm, and convinced everyone that this was a credible organization, and this was a successful model, and this was worth the community's time, money, and effort to support, and a lot of successes since then. That's not to say it's been easy. In fact, in many ways, it's gotten more challenging. Land is more expensive. Taxpayers' appetite for more big bond levies has gone away. The land trust has had to shift to other techniques, such as fundraising in the private community, which is a tough work, but have many successes. So let me turn it over to Connie to sort of pick up the history from those early days.
Well, one of the reasons I think our board has, and this organization has been successful is because we had the good sense to have term limits.
Absolutely.
and actually, it really is true. I mean, the whole founder syndrome sometimes works fine and sometimes it doesn't. But I actually know other land trusts who got themselves into big trouble because they didn't have term limits, and the board members were on way too long and they're not bringing in some kind of fresh ideas. But anyway, I always thought that was very good of you guys to figure that out at the very beginning. Like Paul said, at the beginning of this whole thing, there was something happening on the island. All these things were coming together. There was the Port Blakely Port Blakely selling off their land and the idea of putting in this gigantic community on the south end of the island. A lot of people were really upset about that. And for all of you who've lived here through that, that was a really big deal. The land trust was formed. And the Grand Forest, although was not totally a land trust project, because people had been working on that and paying attention to what was going on that property. It was school trust land. They kept going through these ideas of selling that land. It was no longer profitable. For the school trust lands were set aside when Washington became a state, and it was supposed to support school construction. And Section 16 of every township was set aside for schools, and that's what the Grand Forest is. Although we don't own all of the acreage in there, but it was no longer profitable for forestry or any of the other uses. In Eastern Washington, they still have a lot of their school trust land, and they use it to raise crops. So they kept talking about selling it, and they would talk about selling it, then it would get put on the back burner, come back again. And this had been going on for a very long time on the island. But at the end of the 80s, about the time the land trust was being formed, the Department of Natural Resources got really serious about it. And they said, okay, we're really going to do it this time. So the land trust stepped in, and Mike Ryherd, one of the board members, was a lobbyist in Olympia. He knew how to work through the system to try to get different designations on this property. None of those worked. And the land trust had a really big meeting at the high school one night and invited the director of public lands for the state of Washington to come and talk about this property. And at the end of it, what happened was he said, all right, I'm going to give you some time to figure out how you're going to purchase this property. And when the time's up, if you haven't gotten the money together, then it's going on the market. And I think at that time they wanted a golf course with,
Again.
yeah, and a whole bunch of houses, and it was like, okay. So that was when the neighborhood group, along with members from the land trust, got together and formed the committee and started this campaign. And fortunately at the time, we also had Chuck Field at the Park District was very amenable to saying, okay, I'm willing to go out there for a bond issue. And I always felt like that was a pretty big decision of Chuck's to make, to put that out there. So we ran the campaign. The voters voted yes to purchase this property, and that was the first success. But I really think it's the Port Blakely selling their property and wanting to put that big development in, the land trust forming, that people could see something was happening here with Willowbrook, and the fact that the community was willing to tax themselves to buy the Grand Forest. And those three things together all happened at the same time. So there was this real big motivation to get something done here. And I think that that's really what started us out as carrying through. People got the idea, oh, we do have some control here. It may not be in regulation, may not be making laws through the city council. And actually we weren't even incorporated then yet, but they realized that you could actually do something about preserving land on Bainbridge Island. So then we just started moving through the list.
Mm-hmm.
The next,
Let me add a little something there, Connie, in the story. One of the things we learned just through experience on the Grand Forest was how to recruit new board members. And as Connie described, some land trust board members were involved in this, as well as Connie Waddington and Tom Schwar and other people in the community. And they were doing such a fantastic job. We said, we should get them on our board. And so we recruited them, both of those two, to join our board. We did the same thing with Dick Brown up at the Bloedel Reserve. We're thinking, wow, there's a guy, a scientist, which we didn't have on the board, and a guy who runs a 150-acre property, most of which is in its natural condition. So those type of people we live in an amazing community with talented and passionate people, and we just kept our radar open. I can't say this was an intentional strategy, but great people would just pop up doing things that were related to our work, and we just reached out to them and brought people into the fold. I do want to mention that when the levy passed, with Connie and many other people leading this effort, 82% of the voters approved a $5 million levy, which this was the early 80s, so we're talking 10 or 15 million dollars in today's dollars. It was a huge victory.
it was a huge deal.
Mm-hmm.
And we were all scared, the night of the election, that we were going to fail at it. Although we really had it out there. I mean, I remember going to the grocery store one day, and it was a September vote, and there was going to be one other thing, or no, there was nothing else on the ballot. And one of the checkers at the grocery store said, okay, now I know I'm supposed to vote yes on this or it wasn't even called the Grand Forest. I know we're supposed to vote yes on this DNR land thing, but is there anything else on the ballot that I'm supposed to vote for? No, just vote on that one and make sure you vote, because we had to have a certain number of voters come out to vote, or it wouldn't have been, what do they call it?
Qualified.
Yeah, qualified.
Remind me the year that this, I mean, I was here, but what year did that happen?
It was in 1991 that.
91.
Yeah.
91.
So actually, while that kind of was happening, but it didn't close until later, after the Grand Forest, was this Meigs Park. And Paul, and especially Jim Cutler, I think, and a few other people had really been in talks with Gail Kuhl about, he had managed to this was broken up into many, many different pieces, and Gail had managed to put them all back together again. And trying to figure out how we could buy that or fund that piece, Meigs Park, because do you all know where it is, or have you ever been there? It's really it's an incredibly important wetland on Bainbridge Island, and it has a ton of history with farming and that goes along with it. So Gail wanted to split it into two pieces. That's why part of it's orange and part of it is green. The green part with the hashing was paid for by grants from the county, grants from the state. And actually there was no private money involved in that. It was all purchased with grant money, which was fantastic. And then Gail retained the orange piece until just into I think it was 2007 or 8 that the
City open space money
city
was
open
used.
space money was used. But he did put a conservation easement on the property that he kept. So the whole Meigs Park there has a conservation easement on it, the part that was purchased and the part that Gail had kept for himself. Then,
Can I interject on that?
Yeah,
Add
sure,
a couple
sure.
little color
Yeah,
on that.
absolutely.
So this is, as Connie said, is a very important wetland. And some of the largest trees, actually the largest Douglas fir, and at the time the largest, I think, alder tree on Bainbridge Island, are on the back side of this. But there's this very vital wetland here. We brought the birding experts on the island out this, and some 80 plus birds out there on a regular basis. And when this went through a competitive process at the state to get the state grant, it was the #1 ranked project in its category, verifying the environmental and ecological importance of that property. The property, when we first started with it, was actually, there was a developer, of course, who often owns these properties, that went bankrupt. The bank actually had these property, and we actually had to recruit Gail to come in here and use his private resources to tie this. Now imagine this at this time. We going to a private developer and saying, we want you to buy a bunch of undevelopable, largely, wetlands, hold it for us for some unknown period of time while we try to figure out how we're going to conserve this. And Gail, bless his heart, did that for us. And we owe a great debt of gratitude to him for being willing to take the risk associated with that transaction.
so the next big one was Gasm Lake. And that one sort of came to us because one of our donors owned Gasm, the whole Gasm property, and was willing to talk to the land trust. I think you guys had a relationship with him at the time.
Couple cups of tea.
Yeah, a couple of cups of tea. And he was very much into preserving the Gasm Lake property, but we needed to figure out how to buy it. He couldn't just give it to us. So many cups of tea and talking about how we would move on to how would we do this. Well, we've had this success of the Grand Forest. We've had this success of Meigs in kind of two different ways of preserving land. So Paul was on the committee, I was on the committee, there were several other people. We had people in the community that were well known in the community to be on this committee, and we thought, well, would the Park District be willing to do this again? The deal was we had a option on the property we were going to trade our option to the Park District at the time of the sale, and with a conservation easement on the whole property. That's why it's all hatched. That took 2 years or so.
3 at least.
3, yeah.
You may recall our first strategy, and many of these projects have multiple failed strategies before you come to the winning strategy. The first strategy was a county-wide open space initiative, $70 million for all of Kitsap County. And Connie and I got on the county-wide steering committee as representatives of Bainbridge Island. The Kitsap newspaper editor was actually a member of the committee and provided a lot of strong support through the paper. But it was a bond levy. It needed 60% approval. There were 5 districts as we divided up the county. Bainbridge Island was the only one that came close to passing it, 59%. But the others did reasonably well for Kitsap County at that time. Most of them were around 50%, and if it wasn't a bond levy, if it was an ordinary levy, this might have passed. But Gasm Lake was our flagship project in that process, and although it failed, the vote demonstrated to us that on Bainbridge Islanders were willing to vote at a 59% level to share a good chunk of their money elsewhere to the county to get Gasm Lake. So
this passed in 1995. And I remember I was gone, and I called Paul and I said, what happened? You know, because there was, and we kind of squeaked by on that one a little bit.
Well, a number of people like all of these projects, lots of people from the community come to help in many, many ways. And there was an active opposition to the project all the way through, and a campaign against it on the island. And we knew we weren't going to do as well as the Grand Forest, nothing to do with the comparison of the properties, but the politics had changed, the times had changed. This was a time of general anti-tax sentiment around the country. I think it was about the time Ronald Reagan was coming into politics. No comment on Ronald, but there was that kind of sentiment. A miraculous group of people appeared. I don't even know who they are today. Connie probably does. People who had worked on other political campaigns, and they put together one of these phone trees within a week before the election and called hundreds of people. So we were gathered, those of us who had worked pretty intensely on this for the 3 years, everyone but Connie, who was elsewhere, at the pub. And back then we had no internet, of course, so we had to call into the county, and as the results were rolling in, and the first 2 phone calls, we were below 60% that we needed for this. So this group was pretty despondent, and the beers were not helping. And finally we got well enough past the 8 o'clock deadline for the votes to come in, and made one more call before the evening was, and the news came in that it had passed with 63, 64%
and you needed
of the vote.
60. You had to have 60.
Yeah. So that was, and as Connie said, that was for about, so the taxpayers of Bainbridge Island voted to tax themselves through the Park District for a bit more than half the money. There were 2 state grants, one from urban wildlife, and then one for local parks. There was a proposal for, and it's still available there in this corner here, out of the 324 acres, about 26 acres were reserved for active recreation. There was a lot of controversy about that before the vote, but one of the strategies that really brought everyone together is, the soccer groups, the baseball groups, the neighborhood, which was most concerned about any development, and the land trust and the park department all came together and concluded we all had the common goal of seeing this property saved, and that was more important that the property be saved than any one interest group's interest in that particular property. So the soccer club and the baseball organization all rallied to support this organization, and without them, this would not have been successful. And then afterwards, we took our time to figure out a portion of the money that was raised, particularly the county money that came in, and a portion of the other money that came in was to be dedicated to create ball fields and soccer fields. And we went through an elaborate process that determined there were better locations for those fields, and the Gasm Lake property has stayed in its natural condition to this date.
So those were the big ones to start. And meanwhile, we're working on private conservation easements on the island too. And there were 7 or 8, maybe 9 even during that time frame that we were working on private donors of conservation easements. So then there were lots of sort of little things that happened, like we got some properties close to Easay Creek in the Grand Forest, and we got 2 conservation easements there, this one and this one, which we've now purchased. Some of us went to the state to get the Easay Creek legally named Easay Creek, which you have to go through this big process. But there were lots of things going on like that that we were doing while these big properties were being saved. But our next big deal was this property, the first part of the wildlife corridor. And we decided to purchase that when it was offered to us by the people of the Derby Downs development up there. And I remember we actually went to the bank and took out a bank loan, and I was terrified because I was the president at the time. And then Tom followed me right after that, and we were trying to figure out, okay, so how are we going to pay for this really? But we came up with, it was $320,000, I think. And compared to what we've done in the past, what we're doing these days, that was not very much. But it was the first time that we raised all the money privately, and it was the first time that we chose to own a property. So this was a whole new thing for the Land Trust, is to get into buying a property with private funds and then retaining ownership of that property. So we made it through that one. Then we continued to work on some easements. The biggest easement, this was a whole new idea too, was to work on the old mill conservation easements. A developer came to us and said, I have this big parcel. I would like to break this up into 5 lots, but I would like to have a conservation easement on each of the 5 lots. So this, again, was something totally new to us, where we're working with someone else, and we're putting 5 conservation easements that are all going to have to be monitored and have a separate written conservation easement for them. And that too was successful. It took us some time to get through that. Tom, I don't know, you might remember more about the legal writing those easements in this particular, what it took us to get through that. So that was something now, again, that was really different. Then the next thing that happened was in 2000, Dwight Sutton, who was the mayor, decided that he would go to the community for a open space bond levy. And in 2001, it passed. And once again, I think the reason that it passed partially is because people saw all of this happening. They saw these great things happening. They realized that they could do something about preserving land. And they once again voted for an $8 million bond levy to buy open space. At that time, the Land Trust got really involved in helping the Open Space Commission not only identify properties, but also worked with the commission to help buy some of these properties. One of the first ones that came up was the Close property. This was 50 acres that was next to Gasm Lake. And we started seeing, wow, we can, a whole great big thing can happen here in the south end of the island. So the Land Trust raised half of the 2.5 million. The Land Trust raised half of it. And then the other half, the Open Space Commission put $1.25 million into it. We got a little bit of deduction from the owner, and we got some grants on that. So that was adding a huge amount to the Gasm Lake property. A little bit later, a couple of years later, the Peters property down here was a 100-acre parcel, and the sisters, who Paul talked about, decided that they would sell half of it. So 10 cups of tea has turned into 100 cups of tea down here. So they sold.
Yeah, it's fair to say that generations of board members
Yes.
worked on this property for a long time.
many walks in the woods and many different things going on with that. But the land trust actually really helped the Open Space Commission with this property too, because the land trust already knew about this property, having talked to the owners for so many years. The sisters wanted very much to have a conservation easement on that property. So the land trust put a conservation easement on it, and the Open Space Commission purchased the property. In the early days of some of these deals, the state allowed you to have a conservation easement on property that was being owned by a separate taxing district like our park district. But once we got to the close property, they allow it, but it's so complicated that it just isn't even worth working at the details of that anymore. So even though there's not a conservation easement on the close property, it's so protected by the grant money that came through to it that there is no liability about that. Not, the park district owns it, but they can't do anything with it. So now we've got this gigantic piece down here, and we've added some other things in the future. We added some more things to it. We got some donated property, and it just continues to be, I'm sure you all realize how big of it's about 450 acres now. Maybe.
I think it's more than that. It started at 326. I think it's over 500 acres. Jane?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's what, 540?
Yeah,
540?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's
With the
bigger than
Gasm.
the Grand Forest.
Yes. Mm-hmm. It's actually always been, the Grand Forest originally was 240 acres, but again, it has grown with various components to be added to it, in part for conservation, but part to create this cross-island trail. From the very beginning of the land trust, there was this notion, wouldn't it be great you could walk from one side of the island to the other, and that trail today now exists. Not all of it in preserved property, and the land trust continues to put some parcels together to make that as a lovely a walk as it can be.
And then the Land Trust also worked with the Open Space Commission to do the Ted Olson Park, which is up on Madison, right here. And that was, I didn't even know about that little park for the longest time, but there's a really nice little park up there. And the heirs of the man who owned that property decided that they wanted to add to that property. So they had the Land Trust and the Open Space Commission work together and got the money and bought these two little pieces, this piece right here, to add to the park. This is a conservation easement across the road from it. Then the Land Trust did something else that was very different for them, and that was they entered into a deal for the heart of the forest. And that is this blue. And one of the reasons for doing this is we've got Grand Forest piece here, Grand Forest piece here, Grand Forest piece here, all along from the very beginning. Like Paul said, we were looking to how can we make all of those connected. And so the Land Trust made a deal with the owner of that property in the middle that was not part of the Grand Forest. He still lives there, and there's no public access to it right now. And because there was no public access, we could not apply for any grants. So he had to raise all the money in private donations. And then when he passes on, then that property will have public access to it. So that was yet another different kind of way of going about.
Let me pause there. I was not on the board or actively involved with the land trust, but at that time. But I had attended a meeting that the Land Trust hosted for people in the community. And as Connie described this was a key connector here to the vision of connecting all these parcels for this trail. So everyone certainly saw the value and the excitement, but as I recall, the purchase price was about $3.6 million. And the message was given to people in this room that this was all going to be privately fundraised. This was a huge challenge and a huge step up. But like a lot of our projects, I would say from the very beginning, we knew the land was important. We knew we wanted to save it. We knew we were going to work on it, but we didn't know how we're going to do this. And that's been kind of the culture and philosophy about it. And you just dive into these with good people and a lot of determination and a great community. And lo and behold, over time, the money was raised and the property saved.
Managed to get it somehow.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, the next really big property was buying the hilltop property that actually does connect those two pieces. And that was the Land Trust's biggest undertaking to raise that money. There's very little grant money on that. There is a little bit that the Park District got. The other thing with working with the Park District and with the grant money from the state is, until recently, and even now not completely, the Land Trust as a nonprofit was not allowed to apply for state grants for open space. So we had to have a governmental agency applying for the grants, and we would have never gotten some of these properties, I don't think anyway. It would have just been too much money. We would have never gotten some of these properties that we've gotten without working with the Park District, because they could apply for the grants. And that's one of the reasons why not only do we not want to own a lot of land, but also they have money invested in this, and it's a great way to put, even though we work so hard on it, to transfer those properties to the Park District. And then it also becomes public, and that's part of the really important things that I think the Land Trust has done, is made a lot of land available to the public.
Yeah, that highlights another strategy here, and this was actually conscious. The Park District and the City of Bainbridge Island are key partners for funding and long-term ownership of particularly the larger properties that we've conserved. Our strategy was to get Land Trust members on the Park District Board and the City Council. And without actually much effort, I think during much of this time, every member of the Park District Board was a Bainbridge Island Land Trust member, and every City Council member was a Bainbridge Island Land Trust member. So they were working with us, getting our messages, learning about what we're doing. I actually ran unopposed, and I have nothing to brag about, to become a Park District Commissioner before we put the Gasm Lake bond levy, to make sure that we had someone on the inside. It turned out to be a tremendous experience for me. Otherwise, I mean, the park experience was great, but that was part of our strategy. But I think to this day, I've not looked at the numbers. I would suspect a majority of the City Council members are probably members of the Bainbridge Island Land Trust.
And I served as one of the commissioners on the Open Space Commission. So,
we have a question.
Yeah, I have a question. So, is there any reason why the Land Trust would want to own any of the land for more than just a temporary measure? I mean, I don't understand why the Land Trust would want to own land long-term.
well, I think that's something that's going to be a continuing policy discussion with Land Trust. Now, the wildlife corridor, now we've added another piece. This is part of our current campaign of Make the Grand Forest Grander, but this actually is now paid for. We probably will retain ownership of that. We're working very hard to figure out how to do a trail from Meigs over to the Grand Forest, because that was the whole reason in the first place to purchase that property. But the thinking now is to retain ownership of that and then work with the Park District to put a trail through there. We're not in the maintenance business, so it would be hard for us to maintain any big properties. But I think that occasionally some things are going to come up that we're going to want to retain ownership of. But I think that's going to be future discussions. One of the other properties that we purchased with a lot of grant money was the Agate Pass Reserve up here. And right now, we are talking about continuing to own that, but that could change in the future. It just kind of depends on, what the use of it is.
So I'll share my view. A lot of land trusts choose not to own property. And there's a story behind each property that we own, a different story behind each one. Sometimes you hold them because the owner wants you to do that during the course of their life. But they also are opportunities. I mean, if we could sell, the land trust could sell these properties to the Park District or the city, who would maintain them as we would like them to. You can generate money out of those to then invest into the next project. And that has been done. Prentice Bloedel, the founder of the Bloedel Reserve, donated 7 acres of property along the road as you enter into the Bloedel Reserve. We put a conservation easement on that property and then put it on 5 of those 7 acres so someone could develop 2, sold it for about $150,000 and used that money for subsequent acquisition. Mm-hmm. So it's something that you all will be thinking about as board members going forward with the future of this. What's the best way, the best thing to do with the fee-owned properties of the land trust?
So then the last thing that I really want to talk about is the restoration project that we did, which took on a whole new aspect of the land trust, and that was on the Powell property, which is where we're going to have our big party this summer, right here. Very first conservation easement that I ever worked on. I remember sitting with Paul and Nate, and I don't remember who else, out on the beautiful patio at Powell's on a wonderful summer afternoon. So the Powell family was, I think, the 4th or 5th conservation easement. And then when their bulkhead started failing a few years ago, they came to us and said, is there any way you guys could help us out with this? And we started this restoration project that Brenda got a lot of money for, and has turned out to now be one of the models in the Puget Sound for restoration on a shoreline property. So that's a whole new aspect, and as the years go by and the big properties are disappearing, probably in within 10 years' time, this organization is probably going to have to move into being a stewardship organization to not only steward the lands that we have conservation easements on, but also helping to steward and restore, maybe other lands on the island too. So it's all, it all just keeps moving in a new direction, and you will be part of some of those decisions that are coming up in the short term, actually, for some things.
I want to go back just for a moment about the relationship between the land trust and the Park District and the city. There are strengths that each, the nonprofit organization brings to the relationship, and strengths that the governmental entities do. The governments have taxing authority and bonding authority, which the land trust doesn't have, and we've used on Grand Forest and MIGS and the open space package of projects. The governments have a steady flow of income and employees who can steward and maintain the basic elements of these properties. The land trust has many things that governments can't do. We can privately fundraise. Nobody wants to make a donation to a government, but they will donate to a private nonprofit organization. The land trust can move more quickly when a property is threatened or becomes available for sale takes a long time for the governments to act and appropriate money and do all of that. The land trust can come in quickly. The land trust can operate much more quietly and confidentially than public entities that require public disclosure, are subject to records requests and lots of open deliberation. So it's a good partnership, these public-private partnerships, and we've been successful over the course of the history of finding different combinations, different relationships, different tools, different strategies for each of those properties. And I think that will continue. We'll continue to have to be creative, form new relationships with the government entities or other nonprofit organizations to keep this mission and vision going forward. There is no greater time and need for the Bainbridge Island Land Trust than now. The development threat is intense right now, maybe more intense than it has ever been in the history of the Land Trust or Bainbridge Island. Part of it driven by the intense growth and development of the city of Seattle and that population flowing over to Bainbridge Island in Kitsap County. I would say, though, at the same time, the level of interest in conserving the last great places on Bainbridge Island is still very high. And while we've had a lot of success, 1,300 acres, Bainbridge Island is 17,000 acres. So we're a little less than 10% of the island has been preserved through the efforts of the Land Trust. So there is more that needs to be done, I think, is my thinking, but I think the community as a whole. Growth will occur. The strategy on the island has always been to consolidate the growth in Winslow, but we can see that growth is getting beyond the historic boundaries of Winslow, crossing High School Road in the northerly direction, houses popping up certainly everywhere, more and more applications for short platting properties, and there are still plenty of good properties. I think the work of the Land Trust will go on well beyond this 10-year period, but I think the current leaders and John Howe has articulated it extremely well. This critical time here of pressure and limited opportunity to acquire some very important pieces. So you have a lot to do. There's going to be plenty of great projects out there, plenty to celebrate in the next 10 years and well beyond. Connie?
And there may also be still opportunities for conservation easements on properties that, are not 50 acres because those aren't around anymore, but there are some 20-acre parcels or 10-acre parcels or something like that, there might be opportunities for conservation easements in the future, private conservation easements. And, I mean, you will find that we didn't think of something or we didn't know about something and something will pop up all of a sudden and you'll go, oh, wow, I think our best work has been in consolidating these things so that we do have these big pieces left, but there's still lots of little stuff out there too.
Restoration projects like the Powell property play a role actually in climate change and rising sea levels. More natural shorelines will better absorb water surges and rising water lines. Certainly conserving more land along the shoreline will be important for protecting the uplands as water levels rise. Climate change should be, and probably already is, part of the thinking of the Land Trust as we go forward.
And actually, he has started a new initiative about shoreline properties in the Puget Sound region. So,
which is Bainbridge Island and the Bainbridge Island Land Trust are very active participants. Yeah.
So it is something that's in the thought, not just us, but in the big picture.